February 1962. The Washington, D.C., 8:30 p.m. Dean Martin stood in the East Room, perfectly tailored tuxedo, easy smile. Glass of what looked like whiskey in his hand. Apple juice. Always apple juice. He was a guest at a private White House dinner. President John F. Kennedy and First Lady Jackie Kennedy were hosting. High-profile evening. Politicians. Diplomats. A few carefully selected Hollywood celebrities. Dean was there because the Kennedys liked star power, liked having famous faces at their gatherings, made the administration feel young, vibrant, connected to culture. The Frank Sinatra had stronger Kennedy connections, had campaigned for JFK, had organized the inaugural gala, had access. But Dean was there too, not as close to the family, but present, invited, a guest. The dinner had been pleasant. Conversation, wine. The carefully orchestrated performance of power that happens when presidents entertain. After dinner, guests moved to the East Room. Informal gathering. Drinks. Conversation, the relaxed portion of the evening. Dean was talking with a diplomat's wife. Pleasant small talk. Then President Kennedy approached. Tall. Confident, the ease of someone who'd never been told no. Dean. Kennedy's voice carried that particular Kennedy quality. Authoritative but casual. The voice of someone used to being obeyed. Sing something for us. Not a question, not a request, a statement, an expectation. Dean looked at the president. The room had gone quiet, not completely silent, but quiet enough that people nearby had heard. Were watching. Waiting to see Dean Martin perform for the president. Dean's expression didn't change. Still that easy Dean Martin smile. But something shifted in his eyes. Something the people who knew him well would have recognized. The moment when Dean Martin stopped being the performer and became the man. "No, Mr. President," Dean said. His voice was calm, polite, but absolutely clear. "I'm here as a guest tonight, not as entertainment." The room went completely silent. Actually silent this time. You could hear the lack of sound, the absence of breath. President Kennedy stared at Dean. Nobody refused the president, especially not at the White House, especially not in front of witnesses. JFK's face showed nothing. The Kennedy training. Never show when you've been surprised. Never show when you've been challenged. But his eyes showed something. Shock. Maybe anger. Definitely something he wasn't used to feeling. Dean held the president's gaze. Didn't look away. Didn't apologize. Didn't soften it. Just stood there. A guest who'd been asked to become entertainment and had said no. For 5 seconds, maybe 10, Kennedy said nothing. Then he nodded slightly, turned, walked away. The conversation in the room resumed. Louder than before. The nervous energy of people who'd witnessed something they shouldn't have seen. Dean Martin had just refused the President of the United States. In the White House, in front of witnesses, and walked away from it. For years afterward, people who'd been there wondered what would happen. Whether there would be consequences. Whether Dean's career would suffer. Whether the Kennedys would retaliate in the quiet ways that powerful families retaliate. Nobody knew exactly what Kennedy said to his staff afterward. Nobody knew what Jackie thought in that moment. Nobody knew whether Dean understood the risk he'd just taken. The story stayed buried for decades, until the people who'd been there decided the truth was worth telling. To understand why Dean Martin's refusal was so extraordinary, you have to understand what the White House in 1962 actually was. Not as a building, not as a symbol, but as a social environment, as a field of power that operated by rules so well understood by everyone who entered it that the rules almost never needed to be stated. John F. Kennedy in February 1962 was at or near the peak of his public authority and personal charisma. He was 44 years old. The administration was young, confident, riding the energy of the new frontier. The Bay of Pigs had damaged the administration the previous year, but Kennedy had absorbed it, had actually emerged from it with his personal approval ratings intact in ways that puzzled political analysts. The Cuban Missile Crisis was still 8 months away. In February 1962, JFK was the most famous and arguably the most powerful man in the world, and he moved through that power with an ease that was itself a kind of performance. The performance of a man who had been trained from childhood to inhabit authority as though it were simply where he naturally belonged. When Kennedy spoke to people, they responded. When Kennedy expressed a preference, people found ways to align themselves with it. When Kennedy asked for something, the asking was understood by everyone present to be something considerably stronger than a request. Nobody who entered the White House as a guest misunderstood the social dynamics of the environment. You were there because the president had chosen to include you, and that inclusion carried with it certain implied obligations. To be pleasant, to be interesting, to contribute to the success of the evening in whatever way your particular gifts allowed. For a politician, that meant conversation. For a diplomat, it meant graceful navigation of delicate subjects. For a Hollywood entertainer invited to give the evening a certain cultural shimmer, the implied obligation was reasonably clear. Dean Martin understood all of this. He was not naive about power. He had been operating at the highest levels of American entertainment for 15 years. By 1962, had dealt with studio executives and network presidents and Las Vegas casino owners. Had navigated the Rat Pack's complicated relationship with organized crime and legitimate power. Had watched Frank Sinatra's Kennedy connection develop and understood exactly what it meant and what it cost. Dean knew how these rooms worked. He walked into the White House that February evening knowing precisely where he was and what was expected. And he made a decision before the evening began. A decision nobody in that room knew he had made, about what he would and would not do. Dean Martin and John F. Kennedy existed in overlapping worlds without ever being close. The connection was primarily through Frank Sinatra, whose relationship with the Kennedy family was one of the defining celebrity, political alliances of the early 1960s. Sinatra had thrown himself into the 1960 campaign with genuine enthusiasm, had organized the inaugural gala in January 1961, had leveraged his connections and his talent and his enormous cultural presence in service of a man he genuinely admired. Dean was part of the Rat Pack, the inner circle that included Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. And through that association, he was adjacent to the Kennedy connection without being central to it. Peter Lawford was actually Kennedy's brother-in-law, married to Patricia Kennedy, and served as the living bridge between Hollywood and the White House. Dean's relationship with the Kennedys was therefore mediated, always passing through Sinatra or Lawford, never direct. He'd met JFK. He'd been at events where Kennedy was present. But the relationship was social rather than political, casual rather than committed. Dean had not campaigned for Kennedy, had not made the public declarations of support that Sinatra had made. He was present in the orbit without being one of the bodies that defined it. This distinction mattered enormously on the evening of February 1962 because it shaped what Kennedy assumed and what Dean understood about their respective positions. Kennedy likely thought of Dean the way he thought of most famous people who moved through his social world, as someone whose presence added value to an evening. Someone who would naturally want to please the president, someone for whom being asked to sing at the White House would be understood as an honor rather than an imposition. Kennedy's request, his command, emerged from this assumption. He was wrong. Dean Martin did not think of himself as someone whose purpose in a room was to provide entertainment on demand. He thought of himself as a professional who performed when he chose to perform, in contexts he had agreed to perform in, for compensation appropriate to his talent and stature. Being invited to a dinner as a guest was not an agreement to perform. No contract had been signed. No understanding had been reached. He was a guest. Guests ate dinner and made conversation and went home. They did not become the evening's entertainment because a powerful man decided in the moment that he wanted them to. The weeks before the White House dinner and the months that surrounded it were a period in which Dean Martin was thinking carefully about something that would define the rest of his career. The question of what he owed the world in exchange for the fame it had given him. He'd been performing since he was a teenager, had spent decades in rooms, on stages, in front of cameras, giving audiences what they came for. He was generous with that giving, genuinely enjoyed performing, genuinely connected with audiences, genuinely found satisfaction in the work of entertainment. But there was a version of that generosity that could curdle into something else, into an expectation that Dean Martin was always available, always performing, always ready to be Dean Martin on command whenever someone with enough status decided they wanted it. Dean had seen what that expectation did to performers who couldn't resist it, had watched colleagues become unable to distinguish between who they were and what they did, unable to sit in a room without performing, unable simply to exist as a person rather than as a celebrity. He had the apple juice lesson, the 30-year performance of Dean Martin the drunk, that stayed performance precisely because he never let it become reality. He understood the importance of the line between the character and the man. And he had decided, in the months leading up to that February evening, that he was going to hold that line regardless of who was on the other side of it, regardless of how much authority they carried, regardless of what the consequences might be. People who heard about what happened at the White House that February evening constructed their own explanations for why Dean had refused and what it meant. None of those explanations were complete. None captured the full truth. 8 theories circulated in the years that followed. Among people who'd been there and people who'd heard fragments, and all of them were wrong in ways that illuminate why the real story stayed hidden for so long. The first theory was that Dean had been drinking, that the apple juice story was beside the point, that Dean had consumed enough actual alcohol that evening to be less inhibited than usual, that the refusal was impulsive rather than principled. This theory required ignoring everything that was known about Dean's actual relationship with alcohol and his consistent self-control. The theory was wrong. The second theory held that Dean had planned the refusal as a publicity move, that he'd calculated that standing up to the president would generate exactly the kind of attention that money couldn't buy, that the whole thing was a performance in itself. This theory misunderstood Dean's character entirely. He didn't need the publicity, and he wasn't that cynical. The theory was wrong. The third theory suggested that Dean had simply misread the social situation, that Kennedy had been joking, making a light request that didn't carry the weight Dean attributed to it. and that Dean's serious refusal had created a confrontation nobody intended. This theory required believing that the room's reaction, the complete silence, the visible tension, was a response to a misunderstanding rather than to something real. The theory was wrong. The fourth theory blamed Sinatra, held that some tension had developed between Dean and Frank in the weeks before the dinner, that Dean's refusal was a way of distancing himself from the Kennedy-Sinatra connection, of signaling that he wasn't Frank's supporting player in the administration's celebrity circle. This theory contained a grain of something real about the Rat Pack's complicated internal dynamics, but was wrong as a primary explanation. The fifth theory was the harshest about Kennedy, suggested that JFK had a pattern of treating famous people as personal entertainment resources, that the incident with Dean was one of several similar moments that never became public, that Kennedy's sense of entitlement around performers was a known quality among the Hollywood circle that visited the White House. This theory may have had more truth in it than the others, but nobody was willing to say so publicly. While the Kennedy legend was intact, the theory remained unconfirmed. The sixth theory held that Jackie Kennedy had engineered the whole situation, that she'd encouraged Jack to approach Dean, that she wanted to see someone finally push back against her husband's social presumption, that Dean's refusal had secretly pleased her. This theory was built almost entirely on wishful thinking, and nobody who'd actually been there supported it. The theory was wrong. The seventh theory suggested that Dean had intended to comply, had opened his mouth to agree. And then something in the moment, something in the way Kennedy phrased it, something in the room's expectation, had triggered an unexpected refusal. That it had surprised Dean as much as it had surprised Kennedy. People who knew Dean well found this theory implausible. Dean didn't do things by accident. The theory was wrong. The eighth theory, and the most politically charged one, held that Dean's refusal was connected to his discomfort with the Kennedy family's treatment of Sammy Davis Jr., that Sammy had been excluded from inaugural events because of his marriage to a white woman, that Dean knew this, and that his refusal at the White House was a quiet act of solidarity with his friend. This theory gave the refusal a political dimension that felt right emotionally but couldn't be confirmed by anyone who'd spoken to Dean about his actual motivations. The theory was wrong as a complete explanation, though it touched something real about Dean's values. All wrong. Every theory missed the same thing. The truth was simpler and more fundamental than any of them. Now, you might think this was just a celebrity being difficult, a famous man with an oversized ego making a scene at a dinner party. But here's what makes this different. Every other person in that East Room that February evening, every politician, every diplomat, every carefully selected Hollywood name, would have done exactly what Kennedy expected, would have smiled and stood up and sung whatever the president wanted to hear. Because that's what you did. Because the president asked. Because the room expected it. Because the consequences of refusing were real and visible, and nobody wanted to face them. Dean Martin was the only person in that room who understood something the others had forgotten or never learned. That dignity is not a negotiable quality. That it doesn't adjust itself to the rank of the person demanding you surrender it. That a guest is a guest even at the White House, and a performer performs when performing is what has been agreed upon. Not when a powerful man decides in the moment that he wants entertainment. Nobody else in that room had drawn that line. Nobody else was prepared to hold it. Nobody knew in that moment what it would cost Dean to hold it. Nobody knew whether he'd calculated the risk or simply acted on principle without calculating anything. Nobody knew whether he was afraid in those seconds when Kennedy stared at him and the room held its breath. The story stayed buried for years, protected by people who understood that what they'd witnessed was too significant to treat casually. If stories like this stay with you, the moments when one person chose principle over power. Subscribe now. There's an entire Dean Martin playlist of moments like this one, and more are coming. The people who were in that East Room on the evening in question, and the people who heard about it in the days and weeks that followed, gave accounts over the years that collectively painted a picture without ever completing it. A State Department official who had been present gave an account in a 1978 interview, not about Dean specifically, but about the atmosphere of White House social events under Kennedy, in which he described a culture of expectation around famous guests that he called quietly coercive. He said famous people who visited the White House understood they were expected to contribute the Kennedy image in whatever way their fame allowed. He didn't mention the incident with Dean by name, but people who read the interview and knew about the refusal understood exactly what he was describing. Nobody who read it could confirm the specific connection. A woman who had been a guest that evening, the wife of a senator, present because Washington society and Hollywood money frequently occupied the same rooms in 1962, described in a 1985 conversation with a journalist what she remembered of the East Room portion of the evening. She said there had been a moment of extraordinary tension. She remembered Dean Martin and the president standing close together and the room going quiet. And she remembered the feeling afterward, the electric, nervous quality of people who'd witnessed something they were processing as they witnessed it. She didn't remember the exact words. She remembered the quality of the silence. Nobody she spoke to afterward had admitted to hearing the exchange clearly. A member of the Kennedy White House staff, speaking to a biographer in the early 1990s on condition of anonymity, described the aftermath of the evening from the administration's side. Said that Kennedy had not mentioned the incident directly to staff, but that his mood for the rest of the evening had been notably cooler than it had been before. Said that Dean Martin's name did not appear on subsequent White House guest lists. Said that the connection between the Kennedys and Dean, already more tenuous than the connection with Sinatra, simply ceased after that evening without any formal rupture, without any public acknowledgement, without any statement from either side. Nobody on the Kennedy staff explained why. Nobody had to. A Hollywood entertainment journalist who had spent decades covering the Rat Pack and the Railroad in 2005, called The Lost Stories of Dean Martin. Moments who understood their significance or simple unconsciously about the loyalty of word of Rafi out of privy or cautionary, but whether loyalty had kept people, but she witness of people, what she called witness to people, what she called witness by Martin. She mentioned the White House refusal as one of the stories that had circulated for decades in the entertainment world without ever breaking into public record. She described it as a story that people who knew Dean told in private as an example of who he really was underneath the performance, of the man who existed inside the character and who occasionally, in moments of sufficient provocation, made himself visible. Nobody she wrote about would go on record with specifics. Nobody was ready yet to put their name to something that challenged a Kennedy legend that remained even 40 years after the assassination, carefully maintained. Nobody knew in the years that followed exactly how Dean felt about what he'd done. Nobody knew whether he'd had second thoughts in the days after the dinner. Nobody knew whether he'd been afraid of consequences or indifferent to them. The story stayed private in the way that truly significant moments sometimes stay private. Not because people were ashamed of them, but because they were too important to treat as anecdote. If you were standing in that East Room in February 1962, if the President of the United States had just told you to sing, if the entire room was watching and waiting, if every calculation of self-interest pointed toward compliance, what would you do? Could you hold the line? Could you say no to the most powerful man in the world and mean it and not flinch? Or would you smile and start singing and tell yourself it was just one song, just this once, just because it was the president? After Kennedy turned and walked away, after the conversation in the room resumed at that higher, nervous pitch, Dean finished his apple juice and found a different conversation to join. He was not visibly shaken. He was not visibly triumphant. He was simply Dean Martin, a guest at a dinner, doing what guests do. People who'd witnessed the exchange and found themselves near Dean in the minutes after described him as entirely composed. Not performing composure, actually composed. As though what had just happened was simply something that had needed to happen, and he'd done it, and now the evening continued. The president, for his part, moved to the far end of the room. The Kennedy composure was equally visible. JFK was trained to absorb moments like this without showing what they cost him. Trained from childhood to present an unruffled surface regardless of what moved beneath it. But his circle noticed. The people closest to him noticed the slight stiffening, the controlled quality of his movements for the rest of that evening. The way he did not look toward where Dean was standing. Jackie had seen everything. She moved through the room with her characteristic grace, making conversation, being the first lady with flawless precision. And nobody could read from her face what she thought about what had happened. She was as trained in composure as her husband. More trained. Some who knew both of them said. More genuinely accomplished at it. Dean stayed for a reasonable time after the incident, left at an appropriate hour, said his goodbyes with the ease of a man who had nothing to apologize for and knew it. He thanked the staff. He was polite to the other guests. He left the White House the same way he'd entered it. As a guest, not as entertainment, and on his own terms. He did not hear from the Kennedy White House again. No invitation came for subsequent dinners. No acknowledgement of any kind. The connection, already thin, always mediated through Sinatra and Lawford rather than direct, simply stopped. Dean noticed. He didn't mention it publicly, didn't complain about it, didn't tell the story in interviews or in the casual boasting that some performers did about their famous encounters. He carried the evening quietly, as he carried most things that mattered to him. The people who knew him well enough to know the story heard it in fragments, heard it in the particular Dean Martin way. Understated, without drama, presented as simply something that had happened rather than as an achievement he was proud of. Though he was proud of it, the people who knew him well enough to read past the understatement knew he was proud of it. Not because he'd confronted a president, because he'd held the line, because in a room full of people who would have complied, he had been the one who understood that some things don't change based on who's asking. To understand what the White House refusal actually cost Dean, You have to understand what the Kennedy connection meant in 1962, what it opened and what its loss closed. The Rat Pack's relationship with the Kennedy administration was not purely social. It was a cultural and political alliance that carried real benefits for the people inside it. The Sinatra's position at the center of that alliance gave him access and influence that extended well beyond entertainment. Peter Lawford's marriage into the Kennedy family gave the Rat Pack a literal family connection to the White House. Dean's position, adjacent to the connection through Sinatra, present but not central, was more fragile than either Sinatra's or Lawford's, but it was real. Being in the Kennedy orbit in 1962 meant something. It meant calls returned and doors opened, and the kind of soft power that flows toward people who are visibly connected to the most powerful office in the world. When Dean walked out of that East Room, having refused the president, he walked out of that orbit. Not dramatically, not with a public rupture, but completely. The invitation stopped. The association continued in the public mind. Dean was Rat Pack, Sinatra was Kennedy. Therefore, Dean was adjacent to Kennedy. But the actual relationship ended on the evening of February 1962 in a room full of witnesses who mostly kept what they'd seen to themselves. Dean had calculated this cost, or he hadn't. Nobody who knew him could say for certain, but he had accepted it either way. The connection wasn't worth what it would have cost him to maintain it. It would have cost him the line he'd drawn. The line between who he was and what he did. The line between the guest and the entertainer. The line that was, in the end, the most important thing he owned. He'd spent 30 years holding that line with the apple juice. He'd spent his whole career holding it between the character and the man. He wasn't going to surrender it because a president asked him to sing. The story of Dean Martin and JFK in the East Room of the White House is not a story about ego or arrogance or a celebrity behaving badly at a dinner party. It is a story about what dignity actually means when it costs something. Most people understand dignity as a quality that exists in comfortable circumstances. That doesn't require defending because nobody is testing it. Dean Martin's dignity that February evening was tested by the most powerful social pressure available in American life. The expectation of the President of the United States, expressed publicly in front of witnesses, in the building that is the literal seat of American power. Every force in that room pointed toward compliance, social expectation, career calculation, the basic human desire not to create a scene, the awareness that powerful people have long memories and long reach. Against all of that, Dean Martin said 5 words. "No, Mr. President, not tonight." The words were polite, they were calm, they were absolutely final. And in the silence that followed them, the silence of a room full of powerful people who had never heard anyone say no to that particular man in their place, something was established or favorable review or industry favor invitation that into subsequent dinner in that particular given place. The knowledge that he was exactly who he believed himself to be, that the line held, that it held even here. February 1962. The White House. East Room. A president who expected compliance met a man who had decided what he was worth. Dean Martin said no to John F. Kennedy calmly, said it clearly, held the gaze and didn't apologize. And in doing so, in that silence that followed, in those 5 or 10 seconds when the most powerful room in America held its breath, Dean Martin showed everyone present something they hadn't expected to see in that building. A man who knew the difference between being a guest and being entertainment. between being invited and being used, but between performing because you choose to and performing because someone with power assumes you have no choice. He knew the difference. He held the line. And he walked out of the White House that evening exactly the same person he'd walked in as. If you want to see more stories about Dean Martin, the private moments, the refusals, the times he chose the man over the performer, there's an entire playlist waiting. These stories don't stay online forever. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.